Good morning again, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel, which I think that brings a pressing issue related to the topics we've been discussing here. And earlier today, I talked about a moving challenge. I think that what we're seeing when we're talking about geopolitics and local policy colliding, we're seeing that this is something that is being renewed every single day. And the idea of this session is to be able, for us to be able to discuss the impact of geopolitical pressures and regarding digital policy, and when we consider the national efforts they are being carried on by different governments when it comes to the efforts to regulate big tech. I think that we started to understand this as a global issue when we saw that what happened in Australia impacted what happened in Canada, what happened in Canada impacted what happened in Brazil, or what didn't happen in Brazil as we were unable to vote legislation there. But we're also seeing this taking a bigger stage. We have an initiative called Democracia Sempre, which is a gathering of many presidents. They are discussing democracy and constantly mentioning the impact of big tech. So I think that now we have an official forum that is associating democracy with the consequences of the non-regulatory state of big tech around the world. So we have an incredible panel that has been deeply involved with these issues with us. And I will start by Anya Schiffrin, who is going to make a short presentation for us. We're going to have initial introductions, interventions here. We'll have comments and then open to the questions from the audience. So please, Anya.
Okay, great. Not sure if my slides are coming up or not. Okay.
Yes.
So I made way too many slides, so I'm just going to skip ahead to a few. And Paula says I have basically 6 minutes, so I'll just touch on a couple of things. But first I wanted to say how wonderful it is to be with everyone and see so many old friends and new friends. And when Paula says what happened in Australia impacted Brazil and South Africa and Canada, it's actually because we did the work to bring everyone together to have these conversations. And so I think it's very exciting that we're in a place where we can talk to each other. You know, Burcu obviously early on, and Michael, and I do think these groups are really important at this point. So I think I'll talk about 3 things. So one will be a little bit of an update from EU, US, and Australia with the points that Paula's mentioning. And then I just want to respond a little bit to the value of news panel before, which I thought was so interesting. And I will keep an eye on the time. Some of us were in Vienna a couple weeks ago when we launched the OSCE report on media freedom in the age of AI and big tech. And I would strongly recommend that you take a look at some of it, because the report did a really good job of summarizing different initiatives around the world on topics that we're very interested in, such as platform remuneration, and then also what do you do when the large tech companies try to leave? So things like must carry, visibility requirements. Germany has non-discrimination rules about news. So I think if you take a look at that, that will give you a sense of some of the discussions. And we were talking in the last session about next steps. The OSCE has been going to Central Asia. Many of the member states, it's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and there may be some things there that are of interest to this audience. So I thought I would just talk briefly about what's happening. As you can see in the US, we don't have a lot of, in most of the lawsuits against the AI companies for platform remuneration are in the US. And this is really because we don't have a legal framework in the US. We have, so in the US, a lot of law gets created in the courts. And as you know, the United States believes in fair use. So the idea is that the tech companies can just take content without paying for it. And there have been some court decisions just in the last couple of months which have upheld a lot of that. The Authors Guild sued Perplexity, and they're now settling for $4,000 per book. So everybody's busy filling out forms. But in May, the US Copyright Office put out their last report and talked about the need for some kind of copyright coverage of inputs going into AI, and the director was immediately fired by Donald Trump. So what we're seeing in the US, as you know, because you all read the news, is a real move away from regulation of any kind. And of course, the US administration taking this on the road as well. So it's been very interesting reading the Australian press this week, because Albanese government has decided to proceed with the digital levy. And the whole point of that, I think we talked a lot in the previous panel about incentives for payments, and the idea is to create the incentive by saying if you don't want to do a bargaining code, you can pay a levy. And there's a lot of questions going on in the Australian media about, did Albanese, clear this already with Trump, or are they actually doing a huge provocation? So we will see where that goes. In the US, I would say no real regulation, and the investigations are continuing. The House Committee of Jim Jordan has been expanding all of their investigations, which are basically harassment. So recently, as you know, they came out very strongly against the Digital Services Act, and J.D. Vance said in February that the U.S. can't regulate tech, and DSA is censorship, and they're now coming after the Digital Markets Act. So groups that work in this subject are now getting letters. At Columbia, we've been having conversations for the last 2 days about discontinuing some of our convenings on competition policy. So that's the U.S., continuing to be very repressive. Although if anyone wants to talk about Mamdani, it feels like a lot of my students are working for him. So come see me in the coffee break. As you know, in the EU, there are individual lawsuits, and the copyright, the French competition ministry, some of the Italian authorities in Spain, some of the courts have been pushing for protections for inputs, but in terms of the AI Act and EU law, as I understand it, and there are probably more experts in this room, there isn't any kind of framework for remuneration in the EU AI Act. And the text and data mining exception is what the EU uses rather than fair use. So that's some of the, so then I wanted to turn to two things. First of all, I finished a long chapter a few months ago about valuing news, and then a long paper comparing EU and US. So if you want the long version, I'm happy to save it, share it with you. In terms of just how would you value news, which was the topic of the last discussion, obviously there's many ways to do it. You could measure the cost of producing news, which Prem referred to. You could look at the market capitalization of the AI companies, but of course right now they're in loss-making mode. You could look at the harms from the loss of advertising and subscriptions, which is what many publishers do. And you could also look at what FAIR and we tried to do, which is figure out the percentage of queries from the large language models that are news related and impute value that way. So those would be some of the ways that you could calculate value. But as we've all been saying for years, really what happens is it's the law of the jungle. So it really comes down to power and what you can do. So I think we may have somebody later from Cloudflare, but they announced in July that they would start helping websites that wanted compensation from agents that are scraping. And I called them up last week and I asked them what's happening. And I asked whether, I sort of assumed Cloudflare was doing this, not because they're nice people, but because they saw some possibilities to make money. And they said really what they can do right now is block help any site that wants to be blocked, that doesn't want to be crawled, they can block it. And I asked them how many of your customers making use of this, and they said 4 million, which I thought wasn't very much, because I think Cloudflare is like 20% of the internet as far as I can tell, but they said that was a lot. And then they said what happens is that when a crawler comes, they get given a 402 response, which says, hi there, would you like to pay? Which is, how Tollbit works. And they said they've done 1 billion of those so far. And then the agent has to decide whether it wants to stay and pay some kind of licensing fee or just leave. And obviously what I'm worried about is a race to the bottom, as we saw with advertising. So, these crawlers will just decide, well, it's cheaper to get the, Dawn from Pakistan than Reuters, so why would I pay more money? I asked also, are you really making a lot of deals at the moment? And they said, not that much, but this is putting the publishers in a stronger place. And I called one of the big publishers in New York, and they said, yeah, it's a game changer, because now blocking is really the default. Spoke to Tollbit, who said, like Cloudflare, they're not doing any pricing. It's completely up to the publisher. And what they're seeing are that the large AI companies are not really paying, but the small ones do, because they don't want a lawsuit. So I assume this would mean sort of a proprietary, small language model from like a healthcare company or a PR company. They don't want a lawsuit, so they'll pay out some licensing. So so until we see sort of a global response and a legal response, I think we'll probably see more of these kind of ad hoc, smaller corporate things, at least in the US. Okay, sorry if I'm over time.
Thank you very much, Anya. We'll go back to some of these issues. I already have questions for you, but I'll pass to Michael Markovitz.
Thank you, Paula. It's been a hell of a busy year in South Africa. I'm going to talk quite fast because I've got a clip of the M20 Johannesburg Declaration being handed over to our President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday. The M20, for those of you who don't know, is not a government initiative. It was an initiative of journalists, editors, civil society, and researchers, etc., across the global south and in the global north, to put information integrity and key journalist issues on the multilateral agenda, with South Africa hosting the G20 summit this week in a couple of days' time, and came up with a declaration. In order for the flow, I'll ask them to play the video of the handover. Our colleagues from the South African National Editors Forum, two of whom, Isak Minner and Spoon Galwa, are here. And I think it's quite important, as it indicates the fact that one of our initiatives, we've handed it to the minister, and our president is now aware of it. He does take about 2 minutes. I'm going to try to claim some of that time back. You can play the video.
I support all these things that you're focusing on. Safety of journalists, absolutely important. It's been a horror for us to watch how journalists are targeted in war zones, particularly in Gaza. It has troubled us, and I'm glad that you're focusing also on women in media in terms of gender-based violence and children's rights and AI, that there should be some form of regulation and address the market practice thereof, and media viability. And we know that your sector is really facing challenges of sustainability, of survival, and that is the type of discussion that we would like to talk to you about. And I am willing, and Vincent in my office will make it possible, that we sit down and have a proper discussion. And of course, you can shoot as many questions as you want on any issue, but we should also have a real constructive engagement on how we continue to create a conducive environment for you as the media continue operating. You did not talk about our wonderful constitution, but you touched on it, on saying that we've got media freedom in South Africa, and we are like number one.
It's part of the context.
It's part of the context. Because our constitution fully guarantees that. And we as government, much as at times you are a pain in our much as you are like, but one thing we will do is to safeguard your freedom. And even as you say the president is this and that, we will say it. But say it nicely. So thank you very much. I look forward to going through your declaration and your report. I'm really pleased, and you can hear I'm really kind of, the president should never be excited, but I am. I now know president should never say, what is the word?
Shocked.
Shocked. I should never say I'm excited. But this is good.
Okay, so I think you can see the really achievement of getting the attention at the highest level, particularly before the G20 Leaders Summit this week. But let me just go back to the general context, Paula, of information integrity, which I think has become one of the most contested geopolitical arenas of our time. The way information is weaponized today has the logic and consequences of almost military conflict. And I think South Africa, in particular, has experienced this in a particularly brutal way this year. What we've seen from the Trump regime is a particularly vile lie about a white genocide being used as racist disinformation deployed intentionally with geopolitical intent. It was a calculated act of retaliation for two things. One, South Africa's constitutional commitment to transform our economy through black economic empowerment after centuries of dispossession, and also South Africa's decision to take Israel to the International Court of Justice on genocide grounds based on deeply documented evidence. So what we've seen is an absolutely baseless lie used to humiliate South Africa and undermine our stature, and it's not going to work. And what we're seeing now is sovereignty is not only just territorial, it's informational. Informational sovereignty is the power to determine the conditions under which people see, understand, and trust information. And if we're not in control of informational sovereignty, then basically we are basically allowing external actors to define what our democracies are all about. So, you know, I've talked about the M20. I think we're very proud that we were able, through, obviously, from our colleagues in Brazil who started the discussion when they hosted the G20 in 2024, and now we have a Johannesburg Declaration which has, you know, founding proposals on treating information integrity as a public good, looking at media sustainability as a democratic infrastructure, and building cross-border regulation and cooperation. Also want to mention, which is I think very important from a sort of a general geopolitical point of view, you know, we also published last week, our Competition Commission, and Paula, who was in the investigation, produced an incredible report which we're very proud of, that has produced a range of recommendations. And one of the things that I think is very important is that it basically produced a negotiated settlement, so we didn't have any litigation from Google, Meta, etc. And we'll see how they implement it. But the one thing, and I was talking to Paula in the break, is that one thing that they did leave out is the Competition Commission in the provisional report had a digital levy if the platforms didn't comply. This has not been put in the final report, and I speculated that maybe it was geopolitical. Paula assures me that it wasn't. But we do know that the Trump regime has threatened, through executive orders, sanctions on any countries who does digital levies. So just in closing, I think that we're seeing a moment where disinformation is deployed across borders, It's not just about South Africa. I think that information integrity is a precondition for sovereignty. Media sustainability is now a precondition for democratic resilience. And either multilateral resilience adapts to this reality or it will fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So,
Is it on?
please pursue.
Yeah.
Yes, is it working?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up from where Anya and Michael left, and I want to talk about the geopolitics and what's happening, like especially like in these trade deals that the U.S. Administration has been announcing every day. But before I get into the details, I want to tell a story. I think it's very important for us to go back in time. And let's go back to the 1990s. And this is a story that I heard from Shoshana Zuboff. You know Shoshana Zuboff, right? The person who first coined the term surveillance capitalism. And last year, I had the privilege to work with Shoshana at Harvard Kennedy School. So her research on surveillance capitalism and my research on digital trade, like, they intersect. So this is a story that I heard from Shoshana, and Shoshana, of course, tells it better than me, but I'll do my best. So, Clinton administration. So when Clinton took the office, they had the Clinton administration has had these big plans, and like one of those plans was the health, like the health insurance. Anya would remember. So Clinton, one of Clinton's close friends and advisor, Ira Magaziner, keep that name in mind, and Hillary Clinton, they work on this like big health plan. It was like hundreds of pages, and no one wanted to read, no one wanted to hear about it, no one wanted to discuss. It was a total disappointment. And Ira was very, very like frustrated. So Clinton's, since he was a very close friend of Clinton's, they thought about sending Ira to Silicon Valley. They said to Ira, why don't you go to Silicon Valley and spend some time there? Because this internet thing, this is like late 1990s, it's new, and we need to understand. We need to know what to do with that. So Ira goes to Silicon Valley, and he starts to hang out with all the Silicon Valley folks. And then he starts to take on their values. He starts to learn their like view of the cyberspace is something separate from the rest of the society. It should have its own rules, and no one can regulate it because people don't understand how the internet works. I mean, that sounds very familiar, right? Like we've been hearing the same thing with AI. So Ira comes back and he drafts this framework building on these values. And remember this, the global framework on e-commerce, 1997. The framework has 5 principles. The private sector lead. Governments should avoid undue restrictions on e-commerce. Where government involvement is needed, its aim should be to support and enforce a predictable, minimalist, consistent, and simple legal environment for e-commerce. Governments should recognize the unique qualities of the internet. Electronic commerce over the internet should be facilitated on global basis. So this is the framework which established the US policy on tech at that time, the internet. And they said the private sector should lead, they should self-regulate because we don't understand how the internet works and we don't know. So they should take the lead. But the framework also has annexes, and the Clinton administration also gave instructions to agencies, including the United States Trade Representative, USTR, and saying that the internet should be tariff-free, and there shouldn't be any rights, there shouldn't be any custom duties and taxes over the e-commerce or the internet-related services and products. And there should be minimum regulation of online services. And if any government tries to regulate the online services, we should be on top of them. So that's where the digital trade policy established. This is 1997. And many people think that this is like what's happening now is new. It's the Trump policy. But no, my friends. Since 1997, this has been the US policy. The companies should self-regulate, and we should keep governments, other governments, regulating or American companies. So it's interesting because the trade became the foreign policy arm of like US tech policy, this surveillance capitalist business model, which is built on the systematic capture and monetization of human experience, as Shoshana explains. So, and we've seen it, and since then, you know, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump first, and Biden, there was a period, like a couple of years, like where Biden administration stepped back and they said that, you know, we need to curb the tech power and trade policy is part of this whole of government policy. So we need to step back from these provisions, these policies, because these are not good for Americans or American workers. They work for American tech companies, but they are not in interest. And the world fell apart, I have to say, like the world fell apart. But we can see, and the Trump administration reverted to the previous policy. And now we see that in the trade tariff deals that they've been like announcing every day. Last week there were deals with Argentina, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Ecuador. And buried inside these deals, like there were binding commitments to facilitate digital trade, data flows, you know, keep data flowing freely. Any regulation, restriction, limitations you introduce, it becomes a non-tariff barrier, so it takes away all the policy space. And then refrain from imposing taxes, levies, duties, whatever you call. And the interesting thing is none of these countries were planning to do anything, you know, but they still put that in those deals. And then you come to this region, Malaysia, Cambodia, and like there were tariff deals, enforceable tariff deals with Malaysia and Cambodia, very restrictive. Like, of course, there are provisions on data flows, again, data-free flows, so data should flow freely. But also, like, interesting provision, like this is the first time we saw this provision, saying that both Malaysia and Cambodia consult with the US before entering a new digital trade agreement with another country that jeopardize essential US interests. So you can't even negotiate a digital trade agreement with another country being China. And I mean, Thailand and Vietnam also agreed similar measures. But interestingly, there was one provision that no one paid attention because it was in the annex of Cambodia deal, saying that Cambodia cannot introduce digital competition rules that affect US commerce interests. So bye-bye all the competition laws. Like, I mean, Cambodia is not like considering that there are no plans to introduce that kind of competition laws now. But in the future, they won't be able to do that because it became a trade commitment. Because what's happening in this deal is like US told the countries, if you want to sell your goods in the US market, you need to agree with these rules. And countries, of course, they prioritize their economy. You know, if the US is your biggest export market, you care about it. You don't really think about digital competition laws. But, you know, it's interesting because when the Trump administration first took the office, they were very big on American workers, protecting the interests of American workers. And all these deals, like they were trying to correct what the NAFTA and other trade deals like had created, right? The complete industrialization, all the manufacturing left the US. Like people lost their jobs, communities lost the wealth, and like it harmed many people. But what they're now doing is they are creating immunity for big tech companies. And the tech companies are the biggest winners of these tariff deals because they use these tariff deals as market correcting market correction mechanisms. That's how they call it, how they framed it. So coming back to the very beginning, surveillance capitalism. You know, surveillance capitalism is there. It's harming many people, and but it's not a business model. It's a governance model. It's a problem for everyone. And trade rules, unfortunately, keeps this system together, reinforces the surveillance capitalist order in other countries. So it is very important to pay attention what's happening in trade deals, because they really set the limits for every government, which one wants to regulate these industries.
Thank you very much. I'm here. We saw that we had 10 minutes, but we had actually 80 minutes left. So no, we still have time to talk. I've been listening to you and oscillating between being optimistic, pessimistic. I think I see myself as a realistic, optimistic, hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. And I think that when we talk about shifting winds here, we need to remember also what happened in Brazil. Brazil was able to, we had a Supreme Court justice that stood up to a big tech platform, in the case Twitter, and said, if you're not going to operate according to our national legislation, you can't operate here. And I think this is remarkable in the sense that open a discussion about this is an element of a lot of big tech put a lot of pressure saying, we won't be able to operate in your countries. We will leave. They're always threatening us to do that. I think it opened an important precedent to want to say, no, either you operate according to your legislation or you don't operate here. And I think this is a conversation that was echoed in other countries as well. But you talked about government. I wanted to ask you about when we were talking, one of the points of this session was to discuss if we're seeing or if there is a possibility of a new multilateralism to emerge, looking into what is happening in all the countries that have been mentioned here. I wanted to add another element. We're talking about governments, but what about the platforms themselves? They're playing a part that could be associated, like compared to governments. Just to quote, The Intercept in Brazil said that OpenAI had a meeting with the Brazilian government saying that they would be willing to invest $5 billion in Brazil, but they won't anymore because of hostile legislation. So what are the consequences when you have the companies in the private sector that could play a role that equals states? How can we talk about a new multilateralism in this sense? Any of you?
I'm happy to have a shot at it, but I just want to say that Burcu probably reminded me that I should probably be calling it the Trump administration, not the Trump regime. But I mean, if any administration has regime-like qualities, it's that one. But I think, ironically, their behavior, their boycott behavior is forcing even more multilateralism, forcing a multipolar world. While South Africa may be targeted, it's not isolated. And I mean, maybe we should call it the G19 this week because they're not coming, but so many other people are. And we've got about 40 heads of state going to be in South Africa this week. So I do think there's a new multilateralism because the strength of the alliances, whether it's the Brazilian government, the French, etc., everyone is very strongly committed to a certain kind of values. And I think this is the moment, particularly from a Ctrl+J alliance point of view, that we can build on this particular historical moment.
Well, I was impressed you used the word regime. I don't think you're the only person doing that. No, I completely agree. I feel like in the first part of the year, you know, we were going around saying, count America out, don't include us, go right ahead without us. And now I feel like it is happening. You know, COP, Seville, the financing for development. Obviously, this is all fantastic for China. I was just in Hong Kong for the last few days. So the US is doing itself a huge disservice. I think we are seeing, though, in the last week, the EU being very, very nervous and definitely dialing back because really a few things. One is the complete dependence on tech, and now we're having all these conversations, including here, and Irene and Gina and so many people have been talking about building your own tech, and that's sort of the new flavor of the month. But also Europe is so dependent because of Ukraine. So I do think that they're in a worse position than countries in the global south that can call up China or work together.
So I think if we are going to replace surveillance capitalism, we should go beyond the critique, you know, not only opposition, but coordination. And we must be ready to build something better in its place, you know, a sovereign infrastructure. And that's what's happening now in Europe, Eurostack. You know, they just realized that we've been trying to regulate these companies, but they are not all companies. And it was interesting. I saw that like 96% of like cloud services that European businesses, consumers, governments use is provided by US companies. Only 4% was European. So you can't really like regulate, like try to regulate like that 96% because the US is there. And as I said, like this is not a new US policy. US has always protected American companies. That has always been the trade policy. But it was behind the closed doors. You know, now it's opening just out there. So we need to build something better in place, a sovereign infrastructure and a model of digital governance that serves people and the planet.
Thank you. I will open to the questions I have from the audience. I have only one more question to you. I think we've been discussing regulation. I think in the past year or so, it has those who oppose regulation have been very efficient in creating a narrative that regulation inhibits innovation, and I think that Europe, it's kind of insisting on that. Regulation is the opposite of freedom of speech. Regulation is an attack on sovereignty. How can we counter this narrative with concrete examples?
I have one, because that's not a new argument. Like like my background is in access to medicines, and I worked as an access to medicines lawyer for many, many years. So, and you know, like one of the arguments we heard was like intellectual property protection promotes innovation, you know, and when countries try to introduce like access measures that inhibits innovation. That was the argument we heard for many, many years. Like, and then COVID happened. Like, you know, when COVID happened, we gave all these protections to pharmaceutical companies. They asked for more and more and more protection because we thought that that would bring us more innovation. And what happened? We didn't have vaccines. Like, and COVID, like the coronavirus was not new. It was there, but there was not a big market for pharmaceutical companies to invest. So they were investing in GLP-1s and other stuff instead of like coronaviruses, because that was the third coronavirus. So they didn't see the market. They had all the protections. They didn't invest. So I asked them, so what happened to the innovation? Like, so that's my story.
I mean, as we know, when it comes to AI, the large American firms want regulation because they want to preserve the incumbents, and they don't actually want competition and upstarts. I think I would say, I know we've had this conversation before, Paula. I think that the question is innovation for who and for what? And I thought it was so interesting. Yesterday, I was listening to Nobel laureate Mike Spence in a meeting about AI in China, and he was talking about an economic concept called the diffusion problem. And I thought that was really interesting because I'd always wondered, why is it that, I don't know what, like, Google is so good at reading your email, but then there's something you actually need and they just can't do it. And I was trying to understand this problem. Like, if the technology is so good at selling us things, why isn't it also good at, like, I don't know, protecting us from spam or something like that? And it turns out that this is sort of a well-known problem with new technology, which is that it becomes diffused unevenly. So we're going to see like tons of AI to help the banks make more money, but we're not actually going to see it help us make healthcare more efficient. So I think when we talk about innovation, innovation, that's that's really the question. What are you going to do with this stuff, and who gets to decide as well?
And there's also regulatory innovation. I mean, the fact is that I think you can show, and people have done research on it, is that without the threat of regulation, without actually regulation being imposed or introduced in a country, you'll find that the platform conversation doesn't really happen. You find there's actually research which shows there's a higher number of grants given by Google and Meta to countries who are thinking about regulation. I think it was Canada, America, and Brazil, which were the top. We're probably up there now. So, innovation on the company side, I understand that argument and really agree with it. But I do think we also need to be innovative on our regulatory solutions. And I think we've made some good starts.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions? I cannot see.
Hi, thank you very much for the lovely conversation. I just wanted to ask...
Can you introduce yourself? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm Doya. I'm from Mongolia. I run an organization called the Nest Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development, where we work on two fronts, fact-checking and also helping media organizations establish sustainable business models. So my question is, you might have heard about the California Senate Bill 53, which was quite... for me, it came as a surprise because I thought it was quite the opposite of US policy towards tech and innovation. Do you think that's probably a thing that creates hope for us going forward? California being such an important state in terms of tech companies as well. So that's the first part of the question. So that's one thing if things are changing to the positive in the global north. But for those changes to come into the global south, for instance, the case of Mongolia, we are 50 times smaller than NVIDIA in terms of economy. So how do we make sure that any positive change that may result from these constructive discussions come to countries as small as Mongolia that are basically irrelevant to these tech companies in terms of our economy? Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yes, yes, there is another one there.
Oh, yeah. Let's balance the room so we can take Alina's question as well.
Alina Noor, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I was really intrigued by Burcu's interventions on the agreements on reciprocal tariffs. So I work in the think tank space, and my colleagues and I have been looking at some of these agreements, particularly the ones in Malaysia and Cambodia. And there seems to be this disjuncture between what the leaders are doing and what the people want, right? And so there's also kind of a time dissonance because these agreements lock countries in for the long term. But we're also talking about creating change now in order for long-term changes to happen. But these agreements show that that's not happening. And so how do we reconcile this difference between what's going on now at kind of the leader level and what the people on the ground want in order to make real sustainable change? Thanks.
And let's have one last one there and then.
Hello. Angie Drobnik-Holin with the International Fact-Checking Network. We represent fact-checkers from around the world, including the Global South. Great discussion. I am curious about the kind of influence that governments have on the tech platform behavior and kind of echoing Duya's point. I think we have seen in Brazil and in India where there are leaders who represent these large markets. If they're willing to show that they'll eject platforms from the country, that the platforms back down. But the smaller countries seem to have much less influence. I'm curious if you agree with that and how those kind of dynamics can be leveraged in the current environment. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we'll stop now, and I'll ask you to answer and also take the opportunity to make your final considerations in this round of answering the questions, please.
Well, I'll try and deal with the smaller country issue because it's asked all the time, because if you look at the South Africa, Brazil, and Indonesia, we are outliers in our region, and that's just because of either the size of the market or the democracies that are in place. And I think you saw from our president, there's a very basic acceptance of media freedom. What we discussed in Johannesburg is if you don't have media freedom, it's very difficult to get to the regulatory discussion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are regional bodies, and I think they need to play a very important role. But one thing I wanted to say about the EU, and you mentioned it, is that our Competition Commission, actually one of the remedies was to say the measures that you're adopting in the EU, Google and Meta, you are also required to adopt in South Africa. So it's actually a remedial action. So therefore, it's obviously a concern if they're going to be walking back some of those remedies because they're already baked into our system. Not that we are reliant on the EU, but it has been seen before as a kind of benchmark, that's right, for regulation, and it is a bit of a concern. So while I haven't really answered that very difficult question about smaller countries because they do lack leverage, the only thing I can say is to try and popularize it amongst regional organizations, representative regional blocks.
Thank you, Michael. Anya, would you?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have any great insights, except that I think Michael's right about this point that threatening regulation is what gets results. And so I think that was Ali Abbas from Ofcom made that point when we were launching the OSCE report in Vienna, that the time when the regulator has the most power is before they actually regulate. So I do think making a lot of noise and putting on a lot of pressure is the only way that we're going to get results, even if it doesn't actually happen. So.
Okay, the question about the lock-in, these provisions, the provisions in tariff deals lock-in the rules like long-term, and you're right. There is a lack of communication, and there are silos even in the governments which sign these deals. There are silos. Like most of the time, there is only one government, one agency or ministry who is negotiating these deals, and they don't necessarily coordinate with the other ministries and agencies. And they are also like very big on digital trade. And the problem with the digital trade is the narrative is so positive. I published a report last month about the geopolitics of surveillance capitalism. And that was one of my arguments, like surveillance capitalism goes beyond tech companies, and beyond governments. It also includes the international organizations, but also the experts, the narrative. So surveillance capitalism, in this case, digital trade, like when it comes to digital, there's a narrative power, and they establish that narrative. So the politicians, they believe in these rules. There's an agreement called Digital Economy Framework Agreement that the ASEAN countries are negotiating. And when you talk to the ASEAN negotiators, ASEAN policymakers about this agreement, everyone talks about that 1 trillion figure that therefore will contribute, the argument is therefore will contribute to ASEAN economy 1 trillion by 2030. So where does this figure come from? From Boston Consulting Group, which did a study back in 2023, never published a report, never ever published a report. And all of the negotiators that I talked to, they haven't seen the report. There are slides about the report, and there's 1 trillion out there. And everyone, all the politicians are they are fired up about that 1 trillion, and they want to sign these agreements, not only with the US, among themselves, in ASEAN. So the narrative power is very, very strong, and they have the narrative power, and we need to challenge that narrative. And I think as this community, this community has a very important role to play. As I said, digital trade is not new, but this was happening behind closed doors. Not many people paid attention. Now it's happening out there. Thanks to President Trump, he keeps tweeting about it, and he's like, this should stop now. It's like you can't, introduce digital services like taxes, and people are like, oh my God, what's happening? But the thing is, it's not new. It has been happening all those years. So we need this community to help us, like, you know, as the lawyers, to create public opinion, to raise the public opinion, because we, like, it is tech companies, it's US government, but it's also the politicians in all these countries who strongly believe in these provisions, thinking that it will contribute to their economy and it will contribute to digital transformation. I know the time is up, but one very small note about California. You know, California introduced the first privacy law in the US. That was like, when was that, 2018? Yeah, 2018. And since then, we've been discussing the federal privacy law. You know, it didn't make a huge difference because there is so much tech lobbying, as again, the narrative power, you know, and so much tech money. So there are all these bills, but we still don't have a comprehensive federal privacy law. So it doesn't mean that there will be a law like that at federal level because of, again, because of the tech power and money in politics.
Thank you very much. I think we have a very clear call to action here. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the questions.